In this lecture, I am going to discuss Philip of Macedon's settlement of the Greek world after the Battle of Chaeronea, and above all, his creation of an outfit known as the League of Corinth, or probably more correctly known as the Hellenic League. And this was founded in the year after the Battle of Chaeronea in 337 BC, and it represented Philip's solution to running the Greek world, and it really is an ingenious arrangement. And one of the reasons why Philip should get high marks, perhaps even the title great in his own right. Well, there are a couple of important points to stress about this, because Philip lays the foundations of the relationship between Macedonian kings and Greek city-states that persist down to, well, 197 BC, when the Romans, called in by the Greek city-states, crush the Macedonian army at the Battle of Cynocephalae, and then come up with a new set of arrangements. And so the relationship between the Macedonian kings and Greek city-states goes back to this arrangement in 337 BC, and in time, though not in Philip's own lifetime, but in time, Philip's arrangements were really seen as the model against which Greek cities would measure the Philhellenism, the generosity, the seriousness of the Macedonian overlord. Was this king really committed to the liberties of the Greek city-states, or was it just a way of controlling them indirectly? So let's look at the events immediately after the Battle of Chaeronea. Late on the afternoon of August 2nd, 338 BC, it was clear that the Greek armies had been crushed. The carnage must have been remarkable, because this was a battle of annihilation. Philip had large numbers of prisoners in his hands. We know of at least 3,000 Thebans captured and 2,000 Athenians. Philip literally could have done anything. And already he had made major advances in siege warfare. His son Alexander would make more. Many of the Greek cities probably worried that Philip's army would show up, lay siege to their city, and storm into the city, that is, capture them by assault. Philip did none of this, and he very, very cleverly divided and conquered the Greek city-states, a principle the Romans later used, and terms were offered to the various belligerents who had been on the Hellenic side at Chaeronea. Athens was in an absolute turmoil. Demosthenes and the other survivors came rushing into the city, explained what happened. The city was in literally hysteria. The senior general Phocion kept his head and urged caution, moderation. Demosthenes and some of the radicals wanted to hold out to the very end, but this was just impossible. Philip essentially took the initiative. He sent his son Alexander, then age 18, along with his senior general Antipater, and Antipater acted as essentially the regent for Macedon when Philip was out on campaign. And Antipater and Alexander developed a very, very close relationship, because Antipater in some ways was a surrogate father to Alex. And in a way that was more than one would imagine, because Antipater didn't get along with Alex's mom Olympias, nor did Philip get along with his wife Olympias, but more of that later. In any event, Antipater and Alexander were sent to Athens with a small escort. They carried the ashes of the Athenian dead, which were returned to the Athenians at no cost. Usually the dead would have to be ransomed, or at the very least, a recognition that they had been surrendered under treaty to recognize that Philip had won the battle. The Athenians were not forced to do this. Philip gave generous terms to the Athenians. They did have to dissolve their naval confederacy. That is, this alliance they put together back in 378, 377 BC. But at that time, the League was largely more of a burden than an assistance. There weren't all that many allies left. There were clericies, and a clericy is an unusual Greek colony. It is a colony of Athenian citizens who retain their citizenship at Athens and vote in Athens. Most Greek colonies were established as separate cities. That is, you left Corinth to establish Syracuse. You now became a citizen of Syracuse, even though you were originally a Corinthian. There were a number of important clericies in the Aegean, notably on the island of Samos, 3 northern Aegean islands that had long been Athenian territory, vital for the grain route. Athens was allowed to keep these. The Athenians were probably surprised. There were no indemnities, that is, no fines. There was no restriction on the Athenian navy, far from it. Philip wanted an alliance, so he could use that navy. The democracy was not changed. Demosthenes and Chares, the commander at Chaeronea, well, They had to check out of Athens for a brief time, but there were no reprisals, exiles, confiscation of property. Philip did not impose a Macedonian garrison. In fact, no Macedonian army entered Athenian territory at all. It was an astonishingly generous settlement. And Philip could argue very easily, well, Athens, as Socrates and the Pan-Hellenists have all been saying, is the center of Greek culture. It should be respected. On the other hand, as I mentioned, Philip was ever the pragmatist, and he realized that the majority of the Athenian ruling classes at this point knew that Demosthenes' policy was bankrupt, and they were willing to accept almost any settlement that at least preserved the outward symbols of autonomy and freedom. In the rest of Greece, Philip was just as pragmatic. He humbled Thebes. He saw the Thebans as a possible rival, and rightly so. The Theban government was changed. Thebes, at the time of the Battle of Chaeronea, was at the head of a democratic federal league. This is the league that had been reorganized in 378 BC by Pelopidas. That federal league was broken up. All of the cities of Boeotia, the other 10 cities, were declared free. Cities that had long been obnoxious to the Thebans, such as Little Plataea along a lie of Athens, and that city had essentially been abolished, were reestablished. Certain border areas that were in dispute with the Athenians were handed over to the Athenians, notably Oropus. And Thebes' own government was changed from a democracy to an oligarchy, that is, ruled by some 300 propertied families. A garrison was imposed on the citadel, that's known as the Cadmea in Thebes. A Macedonian force was stationed there. And Thebes was never again going to challenge the Macedonians in central Greece. On the other hand, the lesser Boeotian cities were generously treated. Likewise, through the rest of Greece, Philip did not garrison many strong points. He garrisoned the citadel at Corinth, the Acro-Corinth, the Cadmea at Thebes, the city of Chalkis on the island of Euboea, which is a strategic crossing between Euboea and mainland Greece. We're not sure he had forces in or near Thermopylae, but essentially he controlled a few strong points necessary for the movement of Macedonian forces through Greece. Other than that, he kept a very low profile. He supported governments that were friendly to him. He rewrote the constitutions of only those states he absolutely had to do so. Many of the states in the Peloponnesus were allowed to continue under their constitutions, some of them democratic, some oligarchic. He went out of his way to punish the Spartans. Now, the Spartans hadn't been at the Battle of Chaeronea. And at the time, the Spartan kings were finding themselves in really desperate financial situation. And what Spartan kings did in the 4th century BC is take the Spartan army along with a bunch of mercenaries out on loan and would fight for pharaohs in Egypt or Greek colonies in southern Italy. And King Archidamus III of Sparta was busy fighting in Italy on behalf of the city of Taros, a former Spartan colony. So he's trying to collect money so Sparta could mount a recovery in the Peloponnesus. It goes to show how bad the Spartan financial situation was. So what he did in the Peloponnesus was to give border areas to his friends. Argos got Kainuria, the Messenians got certain ports, the Arcadians got various mountain districts, and that is, they now were committed to Philip because these areas had been given to him by the Macedonians, and they would back Philip against the Spartans in any case. And this proved to be a very, very judicious policy, and it really explains why most of the Peloponnesian states did not rally to Sparta under their king Agis III, who attempted to mount a rebellion in Greece while Alexander the Great was out conquering Asia. It just never came off. The Phocians themselves did pretty well. For one, they were allowed to reestablish their cities. Their cities had essentially been abolished because of the sacrilege of the Third Sacred War, and their indemnity was scaled back. They reduced it from 60 to 10 talents a year. They did very, very well. Overall, Philip, by the end of the year 338 BC, had pretty much ordered the Greek governments the way he wanted them, and he could conveniently ignore the Spartans. He then issued an invitation that fall to a general conference to be held at the city of Corinth. Now, the choice of the city of Corinth was no accident. Corinth was the seat of the meeting, probably held in the spring of 480 BC, where Sparta, Athens, and the other Greek city-states had gotten together to form the alliance that had opposed King Xerxes of Persia and had led to the defeat of the Persian army in Europe and the emergence of Athens as a great naval power in the 5th century BC. So Philip summoned all the states of Greece. They could all send representatives with full powers to negotiate, and he would reveal to them what he had in mind. Once again, the Spartans sent their delegation and made their usual demands. That is, Sparta should be the head of whatever you're creating, and by the way, give us back Messenia, and then the Spartans went home with nothing, as usual. Meanwhile, the other states were in a more agreeable situation or mood, and at that conference, Philip revealed what he had in mind, which was an alliance. The Greek terms that come down to us are clear. It's a sumachia. It is a full offensive and defensive alliance. We have two fragments of the oaths that were sworn by the various members of this Hellenic League, or as moderns like to call it, the League of Corinth. We also have a notice about the League written by Justin, who is a Roman writer who wrote essentially, the Reader's Digest to Greek history. He has a Latin summary, epitome, of an earlier work by Pompeius Trogus, which is in turn based on an account from Philip's day. And he tells us some information about this league as well. And finally, we have an inscription in probably 303, 302 BC, in which a version of this league was refounded by Antigonus and Demetrius, father and son. They're two of the successors of Alexander. From this incomplete information, we can get some idea of what the organization was in the League of Corinth. Furthermore, this League of Corinth, as created by Philip, is also resting on three important precedents in Greek diplomatic and political history. Well, let's first talk about what we know from the sources of this league. It was a federal league. All the Greek city-states who were enrolled in this league, and that included most of the Greek homeland. The city-states that were not involved included the cities of Crete, the Greeks of Asia, which were under the rule of the great king, and the distant colonies in Sicily and southern Italy. Otherwise, all the states, with the exception of Sparta, were in. They had a federal council, a synedrion, and the synedrion was a term that was used for a number of these federal leagues, and this represented it represented the governing council of the various member states. A synedrion could be either organized federally, that is proportionally by population, or it could be organized as each state gets one vote. In the Second Athenian Confederacy, it apparently was the latter. Every state had a vote. But we gather in the League of Corinth, based on the notices, that this was done as a proportional representation, as we would understand it in the United States, that is, accounting for population. Justin goes out of his way in his epitome to mention that the League could raise 15,000 cavalry and 200,000 infantry. Now, these are essentially a census list of the total manpower of Greece. It's probably rather generous, to say the least, and no force like this was ever raised. But some type of census was undertaken, or each city-state was forced to take a census, and the Greek cities would be very good about it because it represented their population, and therefore the number of representatives that would sit on the council. Athens would, of course, be well represented. Little states such as Phocis and Locris, they actually shared representatives. We know that. So this was a federal league, proportional based on population. The council, the Synedrion, had the powers to determine what the contributions, and the term was syntaxis, contribution, not tribute, which contributions the members would provide. This could be done in the form of military forces. In the case of the Athenians, they would provide a fleet, or money. In many instances, from the start, many of these city-states furnished money to the common cause. And in some instances, when they did furnish soldiers, they hired mercenaries rather than sending their citizen soldiers. The Thessalian League was enrolled. The Thessalian cities were members of this Hellenic League. Macedon was not, which is a telling point and indicative of the fact that Philip understood that the Macedonians were not regarded as Greeks, and anyway, they were his subjects, and there's no need for them to be represented in a federal league. The other important provisions that come through the sources is Philip was elected for life as supreme commander of League forces. The term used in Greek was apparently strategos autokrator, supreme commander, no colleagues. This was at variance with Greek political policy. All Greek city-states had multiple commanders, multiple magistrates. They were fearful of monarchy in any guise. Philip therefore directed all League forces and in effect represented Macedon in the capacity of commander-in-chief of the League forces. From the start, Philip had a very powerful say on that federal council. The Thessalians and many of the lesser cities obviously would go along with what Philip wanted. And when Alexander the Great went to Asia, Antipater took over the place of Philip, and Antipater represented Alexander's interest while Alexander was conquering the Persian Empire, and he too could count on the support of the majority of the members on the council. Therefore, the lesser Greek city-states willingly went into this federal council as a means of maintaining the Macedonian overlordship, but they also saw it as protection against the powers of Athens, Sparta, and Thebes, the great cities that for so long had attempted to construct great hegemonies, but in doing so would suppress the liberties and the autonomy of the lesser states. So there's a good reason to believe among the lesser city-states that, at least under Philip II, the League was popular, or at least acceptable. Certainly not what was expected as a result of the victory at Chaeronea. Philip could essentially have done anything he wanted in the spring of 337 BC. Finally, what was the whole purpose of this outfit? And this is where Philip was really marvelous. The purpose of the Hellenic League was to avenge the impiety of the great king of Persia, which translates as follows. In 480 BC, King Xerxes of Persia had burned the Acropolis of Athens, all the great temples, and had sacked the city. This was now proclaimed as a national humiliation. And I think the Athenians sort of liked that. You know, Athens was damaged by the Persians, therefore all of Greece must avenge it. And people such as Aeschines could get along with it. Demosthenes, of course, would never buy anything. But that the burning of the temples by Xerxes was the height of Persian arrogance and impiety, and that a war would be waged by all the Greeks, a pan-Hellenic war, an all-Greek war, under the command of Philip to avenge this insult. Well, one wonders what the king of Persia made of this in 337 BC. That would have been Artaxerxes IV, the young son of Artaxerxes III, and later he was to be replaced by Darius III. I think the great king had no illusions about what this meant. It was a pretext for Philip to mobilize the military forces of the Greek world in combination with his royal Macedonian army and all those marvelous bellicose, crazy Balkan peoples he had conquered, to invade Asia Minor and take over the western satrapies of the Persian Empire. But it was couched in this pan-Hellenic language. And that was very important. And that is one of the reasons why I give Philip such high marks. Philip was a diplomatic and political genius. He in many ways preferred that method rather than fighting on the battlefield. To be sure, he was a very, very fine commander, although there is a remark attributed to Philip that he owed a great deal to his best commander, Parmenio, who will appear in the Asian expedition as the second in command to Alexander. And Parmenio is of the generation of Philip. And the remark is that Philip once said that, yes, the Athenians have many generals, and they do, as do other Greek city-states. And I have only one good one, Parmenio, a great general. In any event, Philip himself did prefer diplomacy, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One was those years he spent in Thebes, somewhere between 368 and 366 or 365 BC, when he was an adolescent. At the time, he was only the third son of the king of Macedon. He was not destined to become king of Macedon. The death of his two older brothers put him on the throne in 359 BC. And in Thebes, he may not have seen the Theban army in military action, but he learned a great deal on how politics were conducted in a democracy. He saw the Theban assembly, the assembly of the Boeotian League. He had a very good understanding of Theban power. And Philip learned about the importance of those two crucial words, autonomia, eleutheria, that is autonomy and freedom. Autonomy, the right to live under one's ancestral constitution and laws. All Greek city-states aspire to this. And eleutheria, freedom, meaning the right to conduct one's foreign policy, one's destinies without interference by an outside power. That was always trampled upon by the great hegemon Sparta or Athens in one way or another. And so Philip was acutely aware of these Greek political sensibilities, and that's why he crafted the League of Corinth the way he did. That is why he did a minimum of garrisoning points in the Greek world. That is, only the 3 or 4 strategic points he absolutely must control. had a Macedonian garrison, and that garrison was not the governing body even of Thebes. That is, the Thebans ran their government. There just happened to be a Macedonian garrison on the Cadmea in the event there's an uprising or the Macedonians have to move in. So in this regard, Philip's background, that time he spent in Thebes, was a very formative and important time. It was probably between, roughly around the ages of 13 and 16. And when we turn to Alexander the Great soon, at that time in Alexander's life, Macedon was a great power. It was expanding. Alex was studying with Aristotle and his friends at Mysa. Alexander was reared as a great prince to succeed to a brilliant political heritage. He had a very different view of Greek city-states, whereas the father understood these matters. He also learned how to bribe and intimidate Greek politicians, and in terms of mendacity, he was far better than any Greek, and in that regard, he was Greek as any Greek politician, and won the admiration of some and the jealousy of all. So Philip put together this league, and he really was following three Greek political principles that he understood. And these were notions that had been circulated among Greek intellectuals, particularly in Athens, but in other city-states as well. And we can break them down to the question of Pan-Hellenism, what is known as the Common Peace, the Koinai Irene, and then the Federal Leagues. Philip drew on all three of these to craft this League of Corinth. And this made this League of Corinth palatable in many ways. When Philip achieved the position he did in the Greek world, Socrates, now in his 80s, wrote letters to Philip and encouraging Philip to undertake that crusade, or that Pan-Hellenic war. Crusade is really a loaded term. It doesn't really apply to the Greek world. That this Pan-Hellenic war that he had proclaimed back in 380 BC. He also urged upon Philip to colonize Asia Minor, to export the excess population. And this goes back to a point that was made very, very strongly back in 380 BC in his so-called Panegyricus, when Socrates essentially redefined Greek identity, and he said in that oration as follows: Athens has so far outrun the rest of mankind in thought and speech, meaning in the powers of oratory and reasoned government, that her disciples are the masters of the rest, and it is due to her that the word Greek, actually Hellene is the word he's using, is not so much a term of birth as of a mentality, and is applied to a common culture rather than to a common descent. Socrates and his followers like to see in the League of Corinth the fulfillment of that notion. We are going to create a Pan-Hellenic League. We are going to conquer regions of the Persian Empire. We will send out colonies. And yes, even the native peoples, Lydians, Carians, Phrygians, Phoenicians, they could, if they adopted the city-state institutions and the culture of Athens, become part of that wider Hellenic world. And Philip was not unaware of these notions. And perhaps only a small number of Athenians really genuinely believed in him. But that whole Pan-Hellenic dimension to the League of Corinth was extremely important. And the stressing of the avenging of the temple burning by Xerxes, even Alexander the Great, whose interest in these Pan-Hellenic appeals was not really very strong. Even Alexander the Great, when he finally occupies the Persian ritual capital at Persepolis, has to order the destruction of that palace, probably in the spring of 330 BC, although at that point Alexander really liked the job Lord of Asia, and he was really reluctant to torch such a neat palace, but he had to do so in fulfillment of these Pan-Hellenic ideals that go back to Philip's original organization of the League. And that gained Philip support, at least in certain circles in Athens. And some of that support carried over in Alexander's time and explains some of the reactions of Athenians later on during Alexander's campaigns in Asia. There was a powerful clique that really didn't want to confront Alexander, although Demosthenes was more than willing to embarrass Alexander and raise a war. The second point I mentioned, that Philip also drew on notions of what were known as the Koinai Irene, and this has been the subject of some very important scholarly study. There's several important works on it. And this was a concept that evolved in the 4th century BC. It was an extension of the types of treaties that had been voted in earlier Greek history. Now, treaties are always religious acts. They are oaths. Oaths are taken They seriously intend to abide by them. There is a scholarship that argues that the Greeks were rather cynical about it. It's realpolitik. But the passage I read earlier on, based on the inscription, which is reported in a literary source, that the Athenians went out of their way to destroy the peace of Philocrates, that was an indication that Philip had violated the oaths and that the gods would bring retribution on Philip and his entire house. The Koine Irene was a proclamation within a treaty ending a war, which called for a cessation of all hostilities. Many times treaties were just between two states. Sometimes that state controlled the allies and the allies had no choice. But you would get into very, very complicated situations, as in 421 BC, where Athens and Sparta agreed to a treaty, the so-called Peace of Nicias, but various members of the Peloponnesian League refused to sign it. Some of them cut their own deals with Athens. No more of this. A Koine Irene meant a complete cessation of hostilities. It also had another important provision to it, and that was the recognition that all belligerents at the time, and neutrals, at the time that the treaty was proclaimed, their governments were legitimate. And outstanding issues would be settled by arbitration. And this often took the form of calling in the priests of Delphi or of Olympia or some type of third party to arbitrate border disputes and other issues, release of prisoners and the like. The first such treaty was proclaimed in 386 BC. That is the so-called Peace of Antalcidas, the King's Peace. King Artaxerxes II at the time was actually a signatory of that treaty, and Sparta used that treaty as a way to impose her hegemony in mainland Greece. But the principle had been established. That is, that treaty is the basis for recognizing governments and arbitrating political issues. There were several others issued after the Peace of Antalcidas. This is one in 374 BC, and we have every reason to believe that in 337 BC, Philip proclaimed a general peace, a Koine Irene, a cessation of all hostilities. That's practical. He wants to use the Greek military forces to assist him in his conquest of Persia. But above all, the cessation of hostilities brought with it the recognition of all governments as legitimate. And that was a very, very important concession to the Greeks, and one that Philip abided by. This later becomes one of the main problems between Alexander the Great and the Greeks, particularly in the last year or so of Alexander's life, where Alexander is now conqueror of the world, lord of Asia, and abiding by these terms is becoming increasingly inconvenient. The third element was the federal leagues that were quite common in the Greek world. There was an effort by some scholars to argue that if the Macedonians had not entered Greece and the Spartans had not mucked up stuff in the early 4th century BC, both premises I think are really dubious, that somehow Greece would have evolved to a United States of Greece, that is, a wider federal league. That the League in Boeotia, the Arcadian League, the League of the Chalcidice offered a way out of reconciling the intense autonomy and freedom of the individual city-state with a wider organization to provide protection. Unfortunately for that argument, when you look at all those federal leagues, they are regional in nature and very much ethnic. That is, Boeotians will band together, Chalcidians will band together, Arcadians, they have the same language, dialect, and cults. But all these federal leagues ever did was produce regional states that attempted to compete with the bigger city-states, Athens and Sparta, or in the case of Thebes, was a way for Thebes to control Boeotia. Nonetheless, the principle of federalism, the representation of all the states in a common council to protect local autonomy and provide wider defense, that principle was understood by Philip and applied in the organization of the League of Corinth, and therefore the League of Corinth in many, many ways conformed to Greek political and diplomatic notions. It had Athenian elements of Pan-Hellenism, it was federally organized, there was in effect a Koine Irene. It was a brilliant solution. And it is really a testimony to Philip's genius that he came up with this solution. Alexander, as we shall see, was temperamentally not as understanding and inclined to run the Greek city-states as just an ordinary commander. But later Macedonian overlords had to take Philip as their model rather than Alexander because of that very, very intense loyalty that every Greek citizen had to his particular city-state. Even the Romans, the Roman conquerors, the great magistrates of the Roman Republic, realized the value of this league. And in 196 BC, Titus Quinctilius Flamininus proclaimed a version of Philip's league as an exit strategy for the Romans to leave Greece and let it run itself on its own. It didn't work very well because the Romans didn't have anything like Philip's acumen in dealing with the Greeks. Nonetheless, Philip's league still stood as a model. And as the most distant echo of it, I close with the fact that the most depraved and delightful of all early Roman emperors, Nero, in a fit of Philhellenism, actually proclaimed his own version of the Greek League, which essentially meant, I won't tax you too much and vote me first place in all musical contests. And that is the last record we have of this notion of a Hellenic League going back to Philip.